It's a great letter, but it is, I'll do it, but here are my conditions.
Okay, let me tell you a story about the letter which Steve Albini sent to Nirvana before he agreed to record their third album in utero. Unfortunately, a couple of days ago, Steve Albini, one of the most important alternative music producers, died at 61. But besides being a great recording engineer, we all can learn a lot from him, not only about the music production. We can learn a lot about our approach to music itself. And actually, I don't want to talk too much about what Steve achieved, which albums he produced. We all know it, you know, Nirvana, No Royalties, Pixies, you name it. I was checking his Wikipedia page and it's like 20 to 30 albums for last 30 years. So it's like this guy was basically living in his studio. But I want to talk more about his approach, his philosophy behind the things he was actually doing. And I wouldn't be afraid to call it a really punk rock attitude, and it would really translate to all the things he did, to all the decisions he made. And I want to start with a letter.
And this letter is not a please hire me letter.
And this letter is just a brilliant manifesto of how theoretically should the music industry work, how the music recording should work, and it should be on the wall of every fucking recording studio in the world. It's so on point, and I'm gonna discuss this letter with you today, and it's actually super inspiring. I can feel that it just tickles some parts inside of me, which just reminds me why I actually started to play guitar, to play music, to record albums, and using all these mics and compressor or whatever in the first place.
Kurt was very vocal about thinking that, never mind, yes, huge hit, but he thought the production was too slick.
Okay, first of all, let's realize what was the position of Steve Albini in the early 90s, before Nirvana.
A lot of people that I work with in the studio are pretty inexperienced, and they think that there is some magic to making things sound good.
He was a really small alternative producer slash engineer. He wasn't famous back then at all. And imagine that you are just getting a proposal from a band who just recorded Nevermind. 9,999 producers out of 10,000 producers would immediately say, sign me in, I want to do it, it's Nirvana. But not Steve Albini.
Most people, I think anyone else on the planet in that position would have said, please, 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 please. And you write this letter
where he describes what is exactly his approach to recordings, what is his philosophy, how he works and how he doesn't work. And there are some things which you will really be shocked about. So let's just get into it and just discuss this whole letter.
Banger record out in a couple of days with a high quality but minimal production and no interference from the front office bullet heads.
And he just wanted ask Nirvana what they truly want to do, because their previous album Nevermind was overproduced. I'm a huge fan of Nirvana. My favorite album is the debut album Bleach, and I believe what Steve Albini wanted to say here, to point here, is he wanted to capture the real essence of each band he records, and he wanted to capture the real image, not the overproduced image.
To me, it always sounds really centered, where it's like the vocal isn't jumping ahead of everything else, or things are like riding up and down. It sounds like the sound of a group in a space.
He wanted to avoid all this extra stuff stepping in between the real sound, the real music, and the finished product. He wanted to make it, you know, one thing actually. And he's actually pointing the whole stuff he hates about big budget productions, like sessions, musicians just making everything just as polished as possible to please all the listeners, widest variety of listeners as possible, to just increase the sales, right?
I'm only interested in working on records that legitimately reflects the band's own perception of their music and existence.
And he points out that this philosophy results in good things but also bad things. You just want the real image of the band. So if the bands feel bad in the studio, they're in a bad period of their career, and maybe they're just a shitty band. He will just capture it, he will not fix it for the band. If the band wrote crappy songs, he will record crappy songs and they will stay crappy. The next thing he is pointing out is the fact that he is not treating this album recording as a project. He believes that the major thing in this whole process is the band. He's truly right. The band writes the album, the band records the album, the band is responsible for the touring. So why we are just putting all these people who are just responsible for really small, not that important parts of the process as almost equal as the musicians are as the band itself? When I read this letter, I just got goosebumps sometimes, because it's so valid, especially these days, in the days of AI making music. He just truly was fighting for the real image of the music, and this is an amazing part here.
I like to leave room for accidents and chaos. Making a seamless record where every note and syllable is in place and every bass drum is identical is no trick.
I truly agree with that. Of course, back in the days when I was a noob engineer, I was really fighting to make all my recordings to sound really pure and pristine. But it changed even with my own music, because I play in a band. It's called Tides from Nebula, and we are in the middle of writing album number 6, and with every album I have an impression that we all want to go more natural, with less fixing after the recording. You know, we have these tools these days, Pro Tools, but it's not the point. We are kind of a decent musicians and we want to keep it natural. So if our drummer Stoic is rushing a bit, he's rushing all his life, we're not fixing it anymore, we're just leaving it like that because it's our sound. I learned playing guitar with this guy, you know, so I'm also rushing on a guitar. This is us, this is how we play it. What's the point of fixing something just for the sake of fixing it? It doesn't sound bad. It's just the character which we have as humans, as musicians, as a band.
99% of the sound of a record should be established while the basic take is recorded.
This is so crucial. Of course, it depends with the genre of the music you're making, but what he's talking about is this real rock and roll band, mostly alternative bands, and this is so sad that less and less people in the industry just follows that rule, because it's really often that when I'm, you know, working with the bands in our studio, they demand to fix a lot of stuff after the recordings. I never agreed with that, and I always push especially the singers to just sing every chorus, not to copy and paste the stuff, because it's just, what's the point? Then he points out that he of course have his favorite sounds, favorite techniques, but all the bands deserve some respect, and he tries to adapt to the sound of the band, so he tries to use his skill set and tools to just bring the essence of the sound of the band to life.
You said, I want to be paid like a plumber. Just give me some money up front, but you thought it was immoral to get points in the record.
I do not want and will not take a royalty of any record I record. No points. Period.
First of all, let me just quickly explain the issue here. When you have a recording session, you have a band, a bunch of musicians, and you have a people in the studio, right? The engineer is also kind of a in-house producer for the band, but it's a tricky thing to define what is a producer, but I'll try to explain it really quickly. For me, the producer of the album is the guy who just gets the songs from the band at the really early stage and helps to actually rearrange the songs, maybe change the compositions a bit. He puts a lot of effort to making these songs much better at the writing stage, at the pre-production stage. Actually, in certain situations, the producer becomes additional band member for some limited time, for the time of preparing certain album. And in that case, I believe it's quite fair to share some royalties with your producer. But I believe that Steve Albini didn't mean that particular scenario. In this alternative rock world, it doesn't actually work like that. Most of the albums don't have real producer, it's rather working already in the studio. So let's imagine a situation, I have a recording session booked for next week. I will be working with the band for 7 days. They just sent me some demos, I listened to it, I thought, okay, so maybe this drum set would be fine or this guitar sound would be fine, but that's all I did. They come in here on Monday, we start setting up the gear, you know, maybe it's a fully live recordings, we're setting up the drums in one room, the amps in another room, whatever, and I'm just trying to quickly find the best sounding setup for them. They also have their own ideas, and for the next couple of days they record their stuff. I basically push the record button, and when there are some musical problems or technical problems, I'll of course fix them, and I'll try to suggest the musicians maybe some improvements in the arrangement, but it's on the fly. But actually before they entered the studio, they worked, I don't know, 2-3 years on these tracks, these songs, and then after this process our timelines just crosses for this particular week, and we work on the final stage of this album, because this album was already done, they wrote it, I'm just recording it. So why me as a person who just recorded the album should have some future money of theirs, you know, from the royalties? Just do your work, take your hour or daily fee, and that's it, your work is done.
On its face, it's absurd. Like, I work on a record for a few days, and then for the rest of your fucking life, you have to keep paying me?
So actually, what can we learn from this letter, and what can we learn from Steve Albini in general in 2024? From my perspective, the perspective of a guy who records mostly alternative indie bands, I should actually read this letter once a year maybe, because it's a huge reminder how the real music should be recorded, how the true music should sound like. I just actually listened to a couple of albums recorded by Steve Albini, and I realized when I focused on the production, there are some things which I would fix these days if I would record it. But when you leave all these small mistakes in, it just creates this whole character which becomes the sound of the band. If you would just fix everything, as most of us are doing these days, it's really hard to hear the real sound of the band. So answer yourself which path you prefer.